Yo guys, it's re-rolling time with the new 100% XP bonus live in Phase 2 of Season of Discovery. Everybody's leveling new characters, so we've got some extremely important Phase 2 DPS information to discuss. As the meta shifts rapidly, you need to know exactly what class to play to maximize your chances of getting a raid spot. So let's talk about the strongest DPS classes in Phase 2. First though, let's talk methodology. This time around, the rankings were compiled by analyzing sims, current logs, and first-hand raid experience. As always, classes were ranked on single target damage as well as AoE damage. Utility was also factored in, as classic raiding is all about debuffs and crucial utility spells. Alright, so let's jump into the C tier. First up, we have the Paladin. For single target damage, they have automatic Crowd Pummeler, which is somewhat ramped up red damage, especially with the short fights. And sure, they can pump out some good single target damage with Exorcist and Seal of Martyrdom, but unfortunately Rets are still not very competitive with single target damage. They're still just barely above ranged hunters and frost mages. As for AoE, some top parsing Rets though are taking advantage of cleaving on Menagerie with their big Divine Storm hitting up to 4 targets at once. Unfortunately, that still puts them nearly 400 DPS lower than classes like mages. Talking utility, Paladins have blessings like Blessing of Salvation to solve threat issues. And of course they have Blessing of Kings and Blessing of Freedom and Blessing of Protection. And while this doesn't really help DPS Paladins, Paladins are the most popular tank as well. The verdict. Paladins bring a very high amount of utility to the raid. Even if their damage is lacking, Paladins are an asset in both speedruns and pugs. Paladins go in the C tier. Moving into the B tier, we have Priest. For single target, unfortunately Shadow Priests have really not been scaling well in Phase 2. Their rotation with spells like Void Plague and Shadow Word Death was strong when nobody had gear, but now Priests are just not competing and are rapidly falling in the meters. As for AoE, Priests have some of the worst AoE of anyone in the game. Sure, they can multi-dot a Menagerie, but their Mind Seer is still borderline useless. As for utility, the low damage to Shadow Priest doesn't really matter much. That's because Shadow Priest may well have the highest utility of any class in the game. Homunculi is absolutely critical for any physical damage comp, and Vampiric Embrace gives extra raid healing for intensive fights like Thermoplug, and you also have all those nice Priest abilities like Fortitude for the raid. Priests go in the B tier. Now let's talk Druid. So for single target, Ferals have come on some pretty hard times in Phase 2. Sure, they bring wild strikes, but their single target damage still isn't bringing it even with the new automatic Crowd Pummelers. And Boomkins are middle of the pack on single target while being frustratingly crit reliant. As for AoE, Ferals still aren't adding very much in terms of AoE damage. And unfortunately Hurricane isn't very strong for AoE for Boomkins either. Luckily for utility though, Druids have incredible utility. They have their Battle Res and Mark of the Wild. Ferals also have Mangle to ramp up classes like Warriors, and you've got Fairy Fire as well. Also, both Ferals and Boomkins can cast Tranquility to prevent a raid wipe at any time. And Innervate feels really fantastic for any Mana-starved class. The verdict. Druids were the most desirable raiding class in Phase 1, but they bring a lot less damage to the table in Phase 2. Druids go in the B tier. Let's talk Rogues. For single target, sure, the best Rogues can pump impressive damage with their white hits, their mutilates, their envenoms. But if you look at the data, most Rogues are still in the low end to the middle of the pack. Compared to even the weakest range classes, Rogues are still pretty far behind right now. As for AoE, Rogues bring very little AoE to the table. That makes them have pretty low DPS on fights like Menagerie. For utility, really the main utility for Rogues is Expose Armor and Kick. Kick is very useful on fights like Thermoplug to be sure, but that's not nearly enough utility to make Rogues a hot class to bring to raids. The verdict. Rogues are in a tough spot because they don't bring massive damage or utility to the raid. Hopefully a buff or two will hit them before the end of the phase. Rogues go in the B tier for now. Let's talk about the A tier. So first up we have Warriors. For single target, Warriors are really starting to ramp up their damage due to excellent gear scaling, and runes like Blood Search are nicely helping them to fit slam into their rotation. As for AoE, Warriors are doing really well in terms of AoE damage, at least when they're allowed to cleave on fights like Menagerie. You've got Whirlwind, Cleave, and Sweeping Strikes, which are all huge for AoE. Talking utility, Warriors primarily bring Commanding Shout and Battle Shout. They also have Sunder Armor, which amps up physical groups. The verdict. Warriors are really starting to come into their own in Phase 2 with excellent gear scaling. By the end of Phase 2, Warriors will be comfortably top 5 DPS overall, which is very respectable. Warriors go in the A tier. Let's talk Hunters. So for single target, melee Hunters are still near the top of the DPS meters, and they are the strongest physical class. Raptor Strike definitely slaps, and your melee hits slap too. And Flanking Strike amps up your damage even more. Unfortunately though, ranged Hunters are near the bottom of the meters, getting out DPS by everyone except Frost Mages. As for AoE, melee Hunters have very weak AoE damage. Meanwhile, ranged Hunters have Explosive Shot and Multi-Shot. Unfortunately, those still don't help them to get past 450 DPS on Menagerie. Talking utility, you'll always be able to offer Heart of the Lion. Meanwhile, if you go MM, you'll get True Shot Aura, giving your party 50 attack power each. The verdict. Hunters are in a very strange place in Phase 2. Melee hunters are still top 5 DPS, while ranged hunters are absolutely rock bottom. Hunters go in the A tier. Let's talk warlocks. So for single target, top warlocks currently have the highest parses in the raid. You've got your amped up Incinerate and Chaos Bolt absolutely blasting. And you have Shadow Bolt as the ultimate single target filler. Meanwhile for AoE, Shadow Bolt volleys insanely strong DPS on trash and fights like Menagerie. The top parsing warlocks are blasting Shadow Bolts and pushing nearly 900 DPS. As for utility, Hellstones, even if not spec'd into them, are 500 health each. You've also got Curse of Elements for those caster groups, and more importantly, Curse of Recklessness for melee heavy groups. The verdict. Warlocks, mainly Fire Destro locks, are having an amazing Phase 2. Warlocks go in the A tier. Let's talk about the S tier. First up, we have Mages. For single target, Mages are number 1 or number 2 DPS on every single fight except Thermoplug. If you want to plug and play a class that'll out DPS the majority of your group from day one, this is your pick. As for AoE, Mages are still the AoE kings, proven by the fact that their strongest fight is Menagerie. As for utility, Mage Portals feel incredible in this phase for getting around the world. And you still have max rank Water, 1992 mana over 30 seconds with a quality of life buff last month. The verdict. Mages are the kings of DPS in every fight, but they particularly excel in Menagerie with their ability to spam out those living bombs. Besides their damage though, Mages are the ultimate vending machines to keep raids running smoothly. Mages go in the S tier. Next up we have Shaman. For single target, dual wielding enhanced Shamans are top 3 on nearly every fight in the raid and they feel hugely overbuffed. LA Shamans meanwhile are consistently top 5 as well with key talents like Lightning Mastery and Elemental Mastery. And even tank Shamans are blasting with top Shamans pushing almost 600 DPS. As for AoE, with Maelstrom weapon, now Chain Lightning is a consistent big AoE damage for Enhance. Plus you've got Fire Nova Totem as well. And Ellie's have Overload to amp up their Chain Lightning as well. As for utility, utility is where Shamans really shine, especially with Wind Fury Totem. Of course we have Druids for Wild Strikes now, but for Horde we have much more flexibility with groups now. And Shamanistic Rage is still a must-have swap for raid mana. The verdict. Shamans, particularly enhanced Shamans, have been massively overbuffed in Phase 2. Shamans have finally come online in Phase 2 as damage-dealing monsters in PvE and PvP. Shamans go in the S tier. What class do you guys think is the weakest or strongest in Phase 2? Who needs some big buffs to start being viable in raids? And also while you're here, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends to see what they think about the list. And next, make sure to check out my full Phase 2 alt picking guide so you end up playing the perfect alt to close out the phase.